are very, very lucky to have her. So get ready for a lively presentation.
Thank you, Anne. Good afternoon, everybody. How are y'all today?
Good.
Great. So you're either going to be really interested or you're going to have time for a nice nap. So your choice, whatever you like. So I've had the great good fortune of being the Director of Collections for the Monmouth County Historical Association since 1992. If I'm there much longer, I'm going to have to think about getting an accession number tattooed on my ankle or something. One of the houses that we take care of, and we take care of 5, is the Covenhoven House. And this story is just amazing, particularly since every word of it is true. And even as a little girl, I've loved history, and this story is fantastic because the older I get, the more I realize it doesn't matter how old you are. You can be 73 years old and still, you'll pardon the expression, be a badass.
Pointed that way.
This way, okay. That's weird. It worked before. She had to advance it for me. Okay, why is
Now I
that?
see why.
What is it? What's going on?
Now,
This is why I bring my IT guy. No? How about down there?
yeah, I see that.
Yeah, I don't know why it's not working. See, we tried everything out.
Tricks to all trades.
No, I don't know why.
Batteries
All right, why is it? Okay, all right, so I'll just say,
Just
the
point
next
to me.
slide, I'll just point to you.
Yeah,
Like, all right.
I got it.
Okay. One of the things that's amazing about Monmouth County is that there is so much of the 18th century still left. I mean, we're sitting in a building right now that was here during the American Revolution. And there's still a lot left. We're so fortunate for that to happen. And a lot of these places, Elizabeth Covenhoven would have known. Next slide, please. And you'll probably recognize some of them.
Brick house,
That's right.
needs paint job.
Yeah, it does. It does. And the Village Inn, a lot of different places. But some things have changed. The Covenhoven House was kind of funny because when the Covenhovens built it in 1753, they built it to face the Burlington Path, which was also known as the Great Path. And this is a road that may be perhaps even 1,000 years old. A lot of the earliest roads in colonial America were following Indian trails. And so the Burlington Path, if you started in western New Jersey and followed it, not only would you pass the Covenhoven House, you'd end up in Shrewsbury by the Allen House, which is another one of our houses that we take care of. And it's kind of interesting because you see, here's the Covenhoven House, Hendrika and John Campbell. Hendrika was one of the older girls in the Covenhoven family. We'll get into her story a little bit more, but she was...
Got laces.
Oh, it has a later? Oh, okay. See, I don't even know what I'm talking. Oh, look, there you go. So that's the Covenhoven House. So Hendrika was one of the older girls. Elizabeth and William had 10 children. She was one of the daughters that you think would never get married. But she ended up getting married much later on. And she was within sight of her parents' house. St. Peter's also still standing. And then you have the courthouse. That was the original location of the courthouse. Next slide, please. So Elizabeth and William got married Elizabeth was in her teens. She was a Van Cleef by birth. And William was one of, I think 9 or 10 children. So there are a lot of Covenhovens. I know we have some here today as well. And the household was very busy, very bustling. We don't know too much about Elizabeth except for 3 days right before the Battle of Monmouth. But we can kind of extrapolate what we do know. She raised 10 children from birth to adulthood, all her children got married and had children of their own. So we know that she was able to keep this very healthy household. Next slide, please. I know I will say as an aside, a lot of people are worried about AI technology taking over the world and so on. We've used AI to come up with some faces and so on, and AI can't do fingers, so I wouldn't worry too much about AI taking over the world because we don't know what Elizabeth looked like. She was not in a particular economic level that she would have had her portrait done. So we kind of imagine what she might look like. This is actually the original door still standing at the Covenhoven house. And we have the house furnished to show you what it might be like during their occupation. Next slide, please. So we're going to get into the Covenhoven family June of 1778. So Elizabeth is 73, William is 76. They have 9 living children, all of whom are married and living within the area, some within walking distance. We have her oldest daughter, Eleanor. Albert was the one boy who died. Benjamin, Hendrika, Isaac, Joseph, David, Elizabeth, William, and Maria. And her 2 youngest daughters were pregnant in the summer of 1778. She has 33 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. And the names you see in red are all those who were actively serving in the Continental Army or militia units in June of 1778, including 13-year-old William. Next slide, please. So this is the Covenhoven house. Now this is the back of the house, and this is what you see when you drive along 537 now. This house came about because of death, oddly enough. When Elizabeth and William were in their middle ages, they were about in their 40s, Elizabeth's father died, and William's father died within 2 years of one another. And so they came into possession of an unusually large amount of hard, cold cash, close to 500 pounds at this time. And they decided the best thing to do with it, because of course there's no Wells Fargo ATM at this time, the best thing to do, sink it in real estate. So they have a new house built. They actually raised most of these children in a very small farmhouse nearby within Freehold. It was around Freehold. And they bought this property from the Cook family, and they started work on this house. Now, they were also congregants of Old Tennant Church. And we think, judging from comparison of construction between Old Tennant Church and the Covenhoven house, that the same builder worked on both. And we know the builder of Old Tennant Church, and that was John Davies of Philadelphia. So we think he may well have been the designer and builder of the Covenhoven's house. And this house is built to last. I think it's probably going to be here for another 300 years. It was beautifully constructed. We actually have some original mid-18th century shingles on not one but 2 sides of the house. And it's very interesting if you know where to look. You can see where the hand-planed shingles stop and the modern machine-made shingles take up. And to think that these shingles have been there day after day, week after week, since 1753 is really just amazing. House was very active. We know based on William Covenhoven's estate inventory that they were raising flax for linen production. They had sheep, horses, cattle. They were doing a lot of dairy production, a lot of butter making. So it was a typical Monmouth County mixed-use farm. And there were other members of the household as well. For many years, a lot of historic sites didn't really want to touch base on the history of slavery in New Jersey. As recently as 1994, one of our own board members of the Monmouth County Historical Association was quoted in the newspaper as saying that they didn't think one of the families, the Taylor family from Markham Hall, one of our other historic houses, they would never have had slaves because they were too sensitive. It's a tough topic. It really is. It's difficult to face. but we've been able to take a look at the people who were living side by side with the Covenhovens and explore what they might have been thinking and feeling as well. Yana was the oldest enslaved member of the household. She was probably about 6 or 7 when we first kind of catch a glimpse of her on the Covenhoven radar. She grew up in William Covenhoven's family's house, and when William and Elizabeth got married, she went to their household, and she was the one who helped Elizabeth raise all 10 of these children, while raising 3 of her own. And we know this because this is a record from Old Tennant Church. And you have here Yana, a Negro wench of William Covenhoven, the son of Albert. And she was professing her faith here March 19, 1737. She shows up again with her children Mac, Cyril, and Nancy. She's presenting them for their baptism, and that's 1746, March 8th. May I have another slide, please? Working on a farm was difficult. You needed as much labor as possible. And because of Monmouth counties and in the larger part, New Jersey's agricultural communities, slavery was an integral part of this. Yana was probably doing a lot of the cooking as she aged. She got older. She was basically doing more work in the house, not so much field work. We know Nancy was closely involved in a lot of the dairy production. Cyril was probably out doing a lot of the field work. They were taking care, they had a very large dairy cow herd. New Jersey was at this time part of what was known as the Great Butter Belt. And it was just a, sort of this rough area that ran from about Massachusetts down to Delaware. It was just a great temperate climate. It wasn't too rocky, there weren't too many big hills. It was just perfect for raising dairy cows. And during the 18th century, butter was one of Monmouth's biggest exports, and a lot of it was going to New York, to the big New York City markets. Not only did the Covenhovens put money into the exterior of the house, they put a lot of money on the interior, and some of that still remains. We don't really have this concept anymore right now, but in the 18th century, even moderate people, the moderate economic level, were able to have their houses decorated on the inside. Sometimes just simply paint, sometimes they might have stripes or dots, very simple. Another level might be stencils or something, but the Covenhovens went all out. We have no idea who did the decorative painting. We think probably John Davies, the architect, connected the Covenhovens with an unknown decorative painter out of Philadelphia. The entire second floor bedroom is painted in blue and white, which is why I think Elizabeth Covenhoven's favorite color was probably blue. And this is amazing. This is not stencil. This is freehand work. And it's meant to evoke carved stone. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is the overmantel, and the fireplace is right below. Each panel is decorated, and the room has, and I think we have, no we don't, the entire room, well, that means that you all have to visit the house so you can see this in person. The entire room is decorated like this. So you have the acanthus leaves here. This is called egg and dart molding. And this is all meant to remind you of fancy carved stone, very elaborate. And this is hilarious. I love this. This is called an overmantel painting. A number of 18th century examples from New England survive. Not too many from New Jersey, not too many from the mid-Atlantic states. But this is something that would be very typical. This would be a big panel, literally over your fireplace. And you could pick what kind of scene you might like. Many of them are very bucolic. They show the actual farm. They might show a beautiful pastoral landscape. For whatever reason, Elizabeth and William Covenhoven decided to celebrate the third naval battle between Great Britain and Holland in the late 1600s. And that was really unusual because, of course, Great Britain had the mightiest navy in the world. And this was one time when the little bitty navy of Holland beat Great Britain. So why you would choose this for a decorative scene in your bedroom, I don't know. but the Copenhagens did, and that's what they have. And this is, we don't think the same artist did the overmantel painting as the decorative painting. But again, two mysterious individuals. Now, summer of 1778. The American Revolution had started, and France had come in on the side of the Continental Army. The British were based in New York and Philadelphia, and the decision was made to effect what they called a strategic withdrawal. They didn't call it a rout, they didn't call it a retreat, they called it a strategic withdrawal. And even now when you ride around Monmouth County or on Kings Highway, for example, in Middletown, you'll see a sign that says, this is the route of the British withdrawal. They decided, so they wouldn't get stuck in Philadelphia, they were going to move more than 10,000 British soldiers and a baggage train 12 to 14 miles long. And they were going to move everybody from Philadelphia up north to Sandy Hook, which was under British control, in which case all the soldiers and all the goods and everything were going to be put on vessels and taken to New York. But there were a couple different routes that they could choose. Another thing that happened at this time in May was that General Sir Henry Clinton came back. He had been in the military since the age of 16. His father and brother, he's an interesting figure that kind of only gets a nod during this whole story, but his character is very fascinating himself. He's about 6 foot tall. His father and brother were in the Navy. He chose to enter the Army at the age of 16. And he was a very interesting character. People really admired him, but some of his colleagues actually called him his own worst enemy. He was one of these introverts who really wanted to be a people person. So he was a little prickly. And he also had a heartbreak in 1772 when his wife Harriet dies, leaving behind a mourning Clinton and 5 small children. And he left the Army temporarily, and a lot of his colleagues felt he would never come back. But by 1778, he had rejoined the Army and came to the colonies, and that was his first commission. That was the first commission he was given, was to effect this move. That's a lot of people and material to move. But move it he did. Now, he could have chosen one of 2 general routes. He could take one sort of closer to the coastline, or one sort of up the middle of the colony. He chose more hugging the coast, which meant they were going to go right through Freehold. So a lot of books that you read have the idea that people in Freehold all of a sudden found out that the British were on their way. In fact, they had at least a week or more that they knew the British were on their way. That didn't really help much, though. Because, of course, you can't just pick up and run if you're running a farm. You can't take your crops with you. It's a little hard to herd an entire group of cows. They don't move very fast. And so what a lot of people decided to do was just drop and run. They would pick up what they could, grab their families, and go. There were a lot of swamps and forests around Freehold area, so a lot of people just left. And this is where Elizabeth decided to stay. Some people put as much as they could in carts or whatever. Elizabeth and her family were very busy during this week before the British showed up. They got as many wagons as they possibly could and loaded virtually every single item in their house onto these wagons. Every chair, every bed, every table, everything. They cleared it out. Because even though there was a general order that the British Army had made known that they didn't want any looting or anything like that, it was very interesting how many houses that the British passed seemed to spontaneously catch fire. And Elizabeth and her family, plus everybody else in Freehold, could watch as the plumes of smoke from burning houses, taverns, things like that, came closer and closer down Burlington Path. I can only imagine the emotion that Elizabeth must have felt deciding to stay and knowing at a certain point there was no going back. She had to stay there. Now, you really hoped, I certainly did, that Clinton, who wrote extensively about his American Revolution experiences, in part to prove that he had made every decision completely correctly, had been a little bit more forthcoming with his description about the days he spent in Freehold. While he goes on and on about the battle itself, this is all he says about staying in Freehold beforehand. When the king's army reached Freehold, I determined to halt there for a day and look about me. He doesn't say anything about where he stayed, but he stayed right here in Elizabeth Copenhagen's house. And this is an artist's depiction of that first encounter. There are no men, as we know, in the household. We only know that Elizabeth was there, Jana was there, and Nancy was there. We don't know where William Copenhagen, her husband, was. He might have been sick, and Elizabeth might have wanted him out of the house, so if something bad did happen, she wouldn't have to drag him out. Another possibility is that Ciro, Jana's son, was in his very late 20s or very early 30s. As an enslaved man, well-versed in agricultural talents, he was valuable. And even though the British had made an offer that anybody who wanted to escape, they would give them the freedom, there were any number of recorded incidents where someone, for whatever reason, might not want to go, the British would kidnap them. And there are reasons. My grandmother used to say, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. Even though you were enslaved and could not determine your own destiny, Ciro was in this house, which seems to be relatively stable. He was able to be with his mom and his sister. There might have been friends and family nearby. To decide to escape all that might have been very terrifying. So even though it's impossible to imagine what the thought process might be, everyone had their own reasons for making the decisions they did. So it's very possible that Ciro went with William to either help some of their other children who were also in the way of the British, and many of them still had small children, or they went to protect Ciro. It's also possible that they were a little worried about Ciro, that maybe Ciro would go, and William wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to be tempted. That's also a possibility. We don't know. But what we do know is that when General Clinton and what must have seemed like the entire British Army rode into Elizabeth Copenhagen's front yard, she was in the house. And there were basically Jana and Nancy with her. And that's it. So we talked a little bit about General Clinton. I think it's interesting because he and Elizabeth spoke on at least 3 separate occasions. And I always wondered if there was something about Elizabeth that kind of amused Clinton, or there was some sort of interesting connection, or he maybe respected her bravery for actually standing there and speaking to him. We're not too sure. The scariest thing that happened was the incident about the cows. We're very fortunate that we have not 1, but 2 documents that highlight these 3 days where Clinton was in Elizabeth Copenhagen's house. One of them comes from Elizabeth Copenhagen herself. Now, she was illiterate, but she dictated verbally her experiences these two or three days to the Justice of the Peace, Peter Schenck, about a month after the entire incident. And he wrote everything down. Now, of course, she might have said a lot more that he didn't feel was important, but at least we have things that she described. We also have her neighbor, Dr. Thomas Henderson. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Freehold, and you know when you go past the Route 9 overpass and you go past the Freehold Mall and there's the Walmart, that's right, vaguely where Dr. Thomas Henderson's house and farm was. That was burned. But instead of focusing on his own tragedy, he actually sent a letter to the New Jersey newspapers and Philadelphia newspapers describing Elizabeth's incident. He was so outraged that this elderly woman had been treated this way, and he was the one who called her a woman of unblemished reputation. But right here in her deposition, she said some little time later, after she perceived all her cattle, including her driving by in the same manner. She then made a like application and said they must go without milk themselves if their cows were taken away. The British then gave orders to have them stopped, but before they went off, the soldiers killed and took every one of them, not leaving her a single hoof. Now, normally this was not uncommon. The British would walk by a farm and there would be some cows. They would take the cows, hook them to the back of whatever baggage wagons, because that's meat on the hoof. You don't have to bring this meat with you. The meat is going to walk there itself. And then whenever you need some fresh meat, there it is. You can slaughter one of the cows. It's great. They stopped the whole herd and slaughtered them all in her front yard, right in front of them. Right in front of her. She had to watch all this happen. There was nothing she could do about it. And what's really interesting is that this is in the middle, the end of June. It's one of the hottest Junes on record. Temperatures were in the 80s and 90s for weeks on end. How long do you think this meat is going to last? They're moving. They don't have time to even brine this meat or anything. Most of this meat went bad. This was a message. We're here. We can do whatever we want. And that to me was very chilling. Now, the interesting thing is when Clinton kind of came into the house, he and his officers realized it's empty. There's nothing to sit on, there's nothing to eat off of, there's nothing to sleep on. So instead of really getting mad at Elizabeth, Clinton actually speaks with her directly, face to face, and says, where is everything? And she probably said, well, empty the house. So he bargained with her, and he promised that if she revealed the whereabouts of at least one wagon load of household furnishings, nothing would happen to the house. I don't think Elizabeth really approved of gambling, but she took a chance. And so she actually had Nancy go with a couple of the soldiers to show them where one of the wagon loads of goods were. They brought one of the wagon loads back, and they had some chairs and tables and so on. She never saw any of the stuff again. They took everything. The chairs, the tables, they all ended up on the British wagons. But they actually had some stuff to sleep on and make themselves comfortable. She was only allowed to save some trifling articles. Some clothes, maybe a blanket or two, something like that. They took everything else. So this is another really interesting thing. And again, this gives you a little insight into Elizabeth's character. So in her words, the next morning, she found that everything was gone from the wagon. The only things that were left were a few bits and pieces, maybe a family Bible, some papers, a couple of candlesticks, things like that. And so she went to go get them because they were of no value to anybody but herself. But a guard had been posted on this little pile of debris, and the guard wouldn't let her anywhere near it. So she went right back into the house and for a third time spoke face to face with the head of the British Army and said, I'm relying on your honor. You promised. Those things are mine. I want them. So he had a junior officer go with her, and when they got to the pile, he pointed to her, and I kind of rephrase this a little bit, particularly for younger audience members, but what he really said to her was, there, you damned old rebel bitch, take it and be damned to you. She didn't respond, she knelt down, she put everything in her apron and brought it back inside. And then, the beginning of the morning of June 28, 1778, General Clinton was ready to go. So he left the house, and I have a feeling that Elizabeth stood there and watched them go, and then her knees gave way, and she probably sat down hard on the stairs in the front hallway. And the Battle of Monmouth happened. At least 3 of her sons, one of her sons-in-law and her grandson William, was on the battlefield. William was 13 years old, and he was a drummer boy, and there are a couple of accounts that seem to indicate that he may actually have been injured or wounded in the shoulder at the age of 13. Now, Dr. Henderson is as I mentioned before, he was the other individual who gave us insight into this whole incident with Elizabeth. And he was just outraged. Now, he had lost everything too. And we think there's some indications that he may have been the solitary soldier who early on may have given Washington the heads up that things were going sideways with Charles Lee and the army early in the day. Because what had happened was we really weren't supposed to engage in battle. Basically what Washington wanted the army to do was kind of poke at the British and just kind of follow them and see what they were going to do. He really didn't want a full-scale battle, but his second-in-command, Charles Lee, who always thought he was a much better general than Washington, and lost no opportunity to badmouth Washington. Big mistake, big mistake. He really didn't have control of the men, and sort of the battle just kind of spontaneously happened, and the men were so panicked that they dropped and ran. It wasn't even an organized retreat. It was a complete panic. And someone told, and this, again, we think it might have been Dr. Henderson, told Washington, you may want to go check on this. And when Washington arrived, everybody's running by, there's no order, it's complete chaos. He was so angry that this is one of the few times recorded, not by just one person, but by several people, that Washington lost his temper. And one individual actually described it as Washington was so angry that the leaves shook on the trees. So it's kind of interesting to imagine George Washington, usually very stone-faced, very stoic, getting absolutely enraged. And Washington and his officers were able to get everybody calmed down, turned around, remember their training, because this was right after Valley Forge, and all the soldiers had, that was one of the ways they kept warm. Baron von Steuben trained them and drilled them over and over and over again in military tactics, European battle tactics. And so, actually, we acquitted ourselves very well. A lot of people feel that it was sort of a draw. I kind of lean on the side of the Patriots, because emotionally and mentally, this was just such an amazing victory, because here was this little teeny tiny army, the Continental Army, and supporting militia groups that had been able to acquit themselves very well against the mightiest army on the face of the earth. And I think that might have been one of the first times that people started to think, with a little luck, we might be able to win this thing. Now, we have a map where you can see all of the houses, at least one tavern, all kinds of barns and outbuildings being burned. The British were destroying whatever they could. This very dramatic scene, another fun AI kind of image. But Henderson was talking about the devastation they have made, exceeds perhaps any they have made for the distance in their route through this state. They destroyed at least 8 buildings, all on farms adjoining each other, and the first one they burnt was my own. So Henderson lost everything too. And so another individual, a lady in Freehold, we don't know who that was, she's listing all of the houses. So you have Dr. Henderson, Peter Foreman, David Solomon, David Covenhoven, Garrett Vanderveer, David Clayton, and a number of others. Most of the people on the public road have lost everything the enemy could carry off or destroy. And here's this map we saw at the beginning, and this was made in 1778, just a few days or weeks after the Battle of Monmouth. Here's the Covenhoven house right here, and here's, you can see burnt tavern, burnt house, burnt house. They were burning all along the Burlington Path. Now, interestingly enough, right here is Hendrika's house. And I have a feeling that because it was so close, this one never appears on any of the lists of destroyed properties. I have a feeling that because it was so close, Elizabeth was somehow able to kind of include that in the protection, include that in the bargain. Because this was so close, it's not like Clinton was there with just a couple of guys. He was there with his entire staff, his support staff, a number of soldiers. So you would have had not only Clinton Inn and the Copenhagen House, but you would have had all kinds of tents and encampments and so on. And this being a reasonable house, probably some of the junior officers might have occupied Hendrika and John's house, because John was not there. Captain Campbell was on the battlefield. So here we go through the 4 possibilities as to where William Copenhagen was. As I said, we still don't know. One of them was he might have been sick. The second one is they may have divided forces. Remember, Elizabeth's 2 youngest daughters were both pregnant, one of whom gave birth within the month after the Battle of Monmouth. So the chaos in the Copenhagen family is almost impossible to imagine. It's possibly unlikely, but not completely out of the realm of possibility, that even though William was 76, that was not unknown for somebody, particularly an older man living in a particular vicinity, to join the militia for whatever battle was taking place locally. That's possible. But then possibility 4 right now has most of our votes as to being what might have happened to William, because Cyril was also not in the house. And of course, this was in a way a civil war, and so you had a lot of children and their experiences. And Benjamin Van Cleve, many years after he was 5 when the Battle of Monmouth occurred, his father was a blacksmith, and he wrote many years later about what he remembered, and some of his earliest memories are about the Battle of Monmouth, and he remembers the confusion of the women and children and their flight to the pine swamps. When we had got a mile from home, the British Army were in sight at 1.5 miles distant. The day of the battle was believed to be as hot a day as ever was felt in New Jersey. And he also remembered coming back to the family house, which was basically burned, and pretty much the only 2 things that the British left behind were a pig with a broken back and his father's anvil, which was too heavy to carry. That is something that's very interesting. More men died of the heat that day, and more British men keeled over from the heat than Continentals. A lot of the Continentals and the militia were fighting in their shirt sleeves, because one of the orders that had come down was leave your shirts in the baggage wagons, march in your shirt sleeves. But the British were marching in full wool. And so any of us who have been through a nice, hot, humid Jersey summer, you can imagine what it must have been like marching in full wool. There's always something funny that happens. One of the things that Elizabeth talks about, and this is what Peter Schenck described, and this deponent, meaning Elizabeth, declares that the sum of 51 pounds and 2 shillings, which one of the officers gave her for 50 pounds of butter he had, was all the money or satisfaction she received for anything that she lost. So they took everything. They took chairs and tables and you name it. But one unknown officer walked up to Elizabeth towards the end of this whole incident and offers her 50 pounds for 50 pounds of butter. He didn't have to do that. He could have taken it, but for whatever reason, this particular officer paid her for good Jersey butter. Now it's a little difficult, I had some fun with this, it's a little difficult and a little sketchy sometimes to try and transpose or convert 18th century currency to modern currency. But by one of the online currency converters I used, Elizabeth got about $5.39 a pound, which is what I paid the other day for a pound of butter at Lowe's. And of course, a lot of times you think about all of these battles, and a lot of times people don't think about afterwards, because this wasn't a remote battlefield. This was where people lived. And so you can imagine, now Elizabeth was on site, so she immediately knew that her house was okay. No matter what, she had a roof over her head. She had saved her home. She didn't know what happened, because, there's no texting. She didn't know what had happened to any of her children, any of her sons or grandchildren that were on the battlefield. She didn't know, was William all right? Was Cyril all right? Her friends, relatives, she had no idea. All she knew was that her house was okay. But when people started coming back from where they had been hiding, where they fled to from the swamps and the forests, it was complete devastation. Complete devastation. The British left behind all their dead and their wounded. St. Peter's Church was actually a British field hospital. So there were all kinds of wounded. And another thing that people don't think of is there are a lot of horses that are involved in war. And you'll have dead horses, wounded horses, horses keeled over during the heat. Washington, I think, lost 2 horses during the battle, I think. So you have not only people to bury, but you also have to take a really big hole to bury a horse. So all the work and the cleanup that everybody in Freehold had to do was enormous. It was months and months before things were at least back to normal. So here we hear from Benjamin Van Cleave again, and so when he comes back, we found the buildings around our neighborhood burnt, naked chimneys standing. They cut down the trees in the orchards, the woods were burnt, property that had been hidden, destroyed, carried away. The earth was strewn with dead carcasses. I think here he's probably referring maybe to horses, although possibly human beings as well. They burnt all the family's property. He was able to save one bed with a looking glass. And it's interesting what people would grab. So his father apparently had no shelter, no bread, no clothes to cover them, save for what they had on, but he saved a bed and a mirror. So I don't know why you would grab that, I don't know, but he did. And then, so a yearling, and then the pig whose back was broken, and the father's anvil. And that's probably because the anvil was way too heavy for the British to take away. So after Elizabeth gives her deposition, she signs it, she makes her mark with an X, so that's how we believe she was illiterate. She couldn't either read nor write. And the X at the bottom of the deposition says Elizabeth Covenhoven, her mark. And then the lights go off, and we don't hear anything about her. She steps back into obscurity. And the only other time she's mentioned in a document is at the death of William Covenhoven. We think she died, we don't even know specifically what day she died. We think it was around 1786, because that's when William Covenhoven redid his will, and Elizabeth isn't mentioned. Normally, if a husband and wife were still alive, the husband would make provision for his widow. So maybe, give her a room in the house, and make sure that the oldest son provides her with firewood and food and so on, and make sure that her comforts were taken care of. But that's why we think Elizabeth died in 1786. William had no need for that anymore. But still, after several years, about 4 years, here, a bed, bedding, and bedstead called Elizabeth's. And that's the last notice we have of Elizabeth Covenhoven. Thank you. Any questions? Yes?
Were civilians killed? I know, like in movies, you always see that. Or were civilians actually killed? Like, they resisted? Was there any record of that, or no?
Well, the general answer is yes. They absolutely were. Here in Freehold, I have not come across any specific reference that somebody was deliberately killed. A lot of militia lost their lives, a lot of Continental soldiers lost their lives. A lot of times I've come across general inferences that there was rape, which is one of my reasonings why because you wonder, why did Elizabeth stay? And I think that might have been one of the reasons, because at the age of 73, she might not have had the same worry that a younger woman would have had. But there were people who were killed. I don't know, John, have you ever come across, I don't think I've come across any reference to somebody specifically
Oh gosh, yeah, it's
being
not far
killed.
from here, Thomas Farr. It's
Okay.
a horrible story about the daughter surviving and the mother and the father both being killed.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
I know that the, was it Hannah, now I'm forgetting, I'm blanking on the last name. Her husband was in the militia, she was down near Toms River. And earlier that summer, I think in May, 2 Hessian soldiers showed up on her doorstep. They thought she had money in the house. And she said, no, there was no money in the house whatsoever. They didn't believe her, so they beat her so badly, they thought she was dead. And her 2 small children watched. Yeah. And that was a month before, so I would imagine that people like Elizabeth Copenhagen may well have heard that story. So to make that choice, Elizabeth wasn't guaranteed safety. No one was. You took your chances. Any other questions?
Thinking about that hand painting on the walls of that one room, how do you take efforts now to preserve that and to protect it? Do you put any kind of protective coating over it, or do you just, you don't touch it, you leave it at it?
Least said, soonest mended kind of thing.
Yeah.
We don't do anything. We keep it lightly dusted. Whatever the type of paint the unknown painter used is almost as vibrant as the day it was on the wall. It's amazing. And what's also interesting is that the downstairs room, the best room, the front room, we believe has similar decorative painting underneath the current paint. So that's a long-term project. So I have no idea if we'll get to that before I retire, but we'll see. Yes?
And probably the reason they decided to have that painting was the Dutch. They were Dutch.
Oh, yeah.
One is huge back.
Well, if you think about it, it's really hilarious because when Clinton was occupying the house, he slept in the blue bedroom. So here's the general of the British Army sleeping in this bed, looking at this overmantel painting that is celebrating the defeat of the British Navy, and Elizabeth was sleeping on the milkroom floor. And oddly enough, Elizabeth was probably a little bit more comfortable temperature-wise, because it was really hot, and so she was probably a little bit cooler in the milk room. Any other questions?
Is it open now? I guess the coat, I know, because it was closed.
Yes, it is. We're open Fridays from I think 1 to 4. So stop by anytime. And if you really are interested in seeing the house and cannot get there on a Friday, you can always call. I will probably be the one to meet you out there to open up the house. So, yeah, so that's fine. We went through a major restoration project, so we did foundation work and roofing work. We got funding from the state, from the county, and from the DAR, and from a new grant place, Americana Corner. So we were able to get a lot of woodwork done and stabilization. So we hope the house will be around for another 250 years.
And the Bradley House too, I live there now, there.
Ah.
When are they open? Because they have the thing up, like a sign, but it's old, it says the 14th, they keep it, I went by there today.
And which house is that?
The one right on, the Bradley House, you showed the White House, that was, I think I have the right name.
I
It's
don't
by the,
I
I might have the wrong name, but it's the White House you showed in the slide.
I know the Craig House is that's on the battlefield. The Craig House is open Sundays from 1 to 4.
It's right past the traffic light, you're gonna go toward the mall. It's on Ramsey Drive, so.
I don't know.
Yeah, but you showed a picture, but I have the name on it, I think.
Yeah, I
But I was
don't know.
gonna-
I'm only going to promote our stuff, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, but the Copenhagen House is a real treat. I mean, you're standing there and you can put your hand on the same rail where Elizabeth probably clutched when Clinton walked through the door.
And I'm sorry, what days were they open?
Copenhagen is open on Fridays from 1 to 4. But as I said, if it's, and we're planning maybe some holiday events and so on, because we also restored the hearth. So that's always really special to be able to walk in and see the fire in the hearth and so on. But if you really need to see the house badly, you can always contact me and I can meet you out there and basically give you the same tour. Yeah, same talk. So, yeah.
Great.
Any other questions? Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.